29th, 1943, Attu Island, Alaska Territory. A U.S. Army radio intercept team picks up a transmission from the Japanese garrison commander on the island, sent to his superiors before the fighting ends. Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki writes, "The combined attacks of the enemy land, sea and air units, the battalions on the front line have been defeated. However, our morale is excellent and we are holding in some important points. We will attack and annihilate the United States forces." Hours after sending it, Yamasaki burned his remaining papers, gathered every man on the island still able to stand, and led them into the fog for the only banzai charge ever fought on American soil. Most people who know anything about the Pacific War know the names Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Almost nobody knows Attu, a fog-buried rock at the far end of the Aleutian Islands, closer to Siberia than to Seattle, where a division most Americans have never heard of fought Japan's Imperial Army in conditions closer to the Eastern Front than anything else the U.S. Army experienced in the Pacific. This is the story of the 7th Infantry Division, the division that fought in a place with no name recognition, against an enemy who chose death over retreat, and left a Japanese colonel's own radio traffic as the record of what it cost him. And the 7th Infantry Division wasn't built for this fight. In late 1942, the division was at Fort Ord, California, training for desert warfare. The assumption at the time was North Africa. Then the assignment changed without warning, and the men who'd spent months learning to fight in sand were given a few weeks to become something else entirely. An amphibious division that could land on an island where visibility could drop to a few feet in fog, and where the wind alone could put a man on the ground, and where trench foot and frostbite would eventually account for more American casualties than Japanese bullets did. If this kind of overlooked WWII story is what you're here for, the ones that don't get the documentary treatment, subscribe, because this channel's whole purpose is digging up the campaigns that got buried under Normandy and Iwo Jima. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. The landing came on May 11th, 1943. 4 days late because bad weather had delayed the original plan, a delay that, by accident, worked in the Americans' favor. Japanese lookouts had expected the assault days earlier and had eased off their alert status by the time the 17th Infantry Regiment actually hit the beaches at Massacre Bay, and the 32nd Infantry Regiment landing near Holtz Bay to the north. What followed was not a quick fight. Colonel Yamasaki had roughly 2,650 men dug into high ground across the island rather than defending the beaches directly, and for the next 17 days, American soldiers fought uphill through fog, snow, and frozen tundra to dig them out ridge by ridge. Cleavesy Pass on May 21st, Fish Hook Ridge by the 27th, in weather that made resupply, evacuation of the wounded, and basic navigation into their own separate battles. By May 28th, Yamasaki's position had collapsed to a small pocket near Chichagof Harbor, with no possibility of reinforcement or evacuation. That night, an American patrol crept close enough to see what was happening in the Japanese camp. Wounded men being given fatal doses of morphine, others taking their own lives rather than be captured, in preparation for what was coming. And what was coming was the message Yamasaki sent that evening, and the charge he led in the fog before dawn. The attack broke through the American line further than anyone expected, tearing straight into a rear area held by engineers, medics, and headquarters troops who had never anticipated fighting on that ground at all. What happened when that mixed group of American soldiers held their line anyway, and what was found on the battlefield when the fog finally lifted? And the men who held that line on Engineer Hill on the morning of May 29th weren't infantry. They were combat engineers, medics, cooks, and clerks from rear echelon units who had never expected to be the ones standing between Yamasaki's charge and the rest of the American position on Attu. They held it anyway, in fog thick enough that men on both sides were firing at muzzle flashes rather than targets. By the time the attack broke apart, Yamasaki was dead near the crest of the hill, sword still in hand. Of the 2,650 men under his command at the start of the battle, only 29 were taken alive. The rest died in the charge, in the fighting that preceded it, and or by their own hand in the final hours. Japanese wounded given fatal doses of morphine on Yamasaki's order rather than be left for the Americans to capture. It remains, per U.S. Army casualty figures, one of the highest fatality rates of any Japanese garrison in the entire Pacific War. For the 7th Infantry Division, Attu had been a brutal introduction to Pacific combat, a fight that cost the division roughly 550 killed and over 1,100 wounded. With cold weather injuries, adding hundreds more to the casualty rolls. But it had also produced something the division would carry into every fight that followed. Hard evidence that Japanese defenders on isolated islands were not going to surrender, were not going to retreat, and had to be fought and eliminated position by position, regardless of what that cost either side. That lesson mattered enormously 9 months later, 3,000 miles to the south. By January 1944, the American commanders were still absorbing a much harder lesson from a different battle, Tarawa. In November 1943, where the 2nd Marine Division had taken more than one, and Ceylon's Ol, Ceylon dead, assaulting a heavily fortified atoll after a bombardment that turned out to be nowhere near enough. When the 7th Infantry Division and the 4th Marine Division were assigned Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, the plan built around them was designed specifically not to repeat that mistake. Naval bombardment of Kwajalein Island ran for 3 days instead of 3 hours, battleships firing over 6,000 tons of shells at ranges as close as a mile offshore, with tens of thousands more artillery rounds fired in from islets. The 7th Division's own 17th Infantry Regiment had seized in advance specifically to serve as forward gun platforms. If you've stuck with this series through Attu, and you already know this channel isn't interested in the battles everyone's already made a documentary about. So if that's your kind of history, hit subscribe. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether your own family has a connection to this division or this war. The landings began on January 31st, 1944. Within 4 days, Kwajalein Island itself had fallen to the 7th Infantry Division, and Roy Namur to the north had fallen to the Marines. The Japanese garrison across the atoll, roughly 8 in 500 strong under Rear Admiral Manzo Akiyama, is almost entirely wiped out, more than 8,000 Japanese dead against 372 American dead across the whole operation. On the smaller island of Roy Namur alone, only 51 men survived out of an original garrison of 3,500. What made Kwajalein different from Attu wasn't just the ratio of casualties, it was what the island represented. Japan had held the Marshall Islands since before Pearl Harbor, territory the Japanese Empire had controlled since the aftermath of the First World War, decades before a single American soldier had fired a shot in the Pacific. And Kwajalein was the first piece of that pre-war Japanese territory the United States had taken back. For Japanese planners who had spent 2 years assuming the outer edge of their empire was secure, it was proof that the American army the world had spent 1942 underestimating was now capable of moving faster, hitting harder, and absorbing lessons between battles quicker than their own defensive planning could keep up with. And the 7th Infantry Division had gone from a fog-bound Arctic fight nobody remembered to one of the fastest, most lopsided victories of the entire Pacific campaign in under a year. What it did next, in the jungles of Leyte and on the blood-soaked ridgelines of Okinawa, is where this story finishes. The 7th Infantry Division didn't get long to rest after Kwajalein. In October 1944, the division landed at Dulag on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. The opening move of the campaign's General MacArthur had promised 18 months earlier when he said he would return. A division's first opponent on Leyte was the Japanese 16th Division, the same formation responsible for the death march at Bataan 2.5 years earlier. Fighting through swamp, jungle, and rice paddy, and the 7th secured the Dulag airstrip within 4 days, then held its ground through one of the harder moments of the campaign in late November, and Japanese forces struck the thinly stretched 32nd Infantry Regiment along the Palanas River in an action that became known as the Battle of Shoestring Ridge. Reinforced, the division held. By mid-December, it had linked up with the 11th Airborne Division near Ormoc, splitting the remaining Japanese forces on the island in two. Before Leyte was finished, the division's own record of the campaign put its enemy casualties at over 16,000. And there was no real rest after that either. By February 1945, the division was training for the next objective, and on April 1st, Easter Sunday, the 7th Infantry Division landed on the western beaches of Okinawa as part of the largest amphibious operation of the entire Pacific War. The early advance moved fast, and the 17th Infantry Regiment reached Okinawa's east coast within days, cutting the island in two. And fast advances in the north gave way to something much slower and much costlier, once the division reached the Japanese defensive belt anchored on the town of Shuri in the south. It's here that one of the division's engagements survives in unusually specific detail, because it was documented afterward in the Army's own official history of the campaign. On the morning of April 5, 1945, A and C companies of the 184th Infantry Regiment ran into a 450-foot coral ridge topped with a 30-foot rock spire the Americans nicknamed the Pinnacle. It was defended by roughly 110 Japanese soldiers under a young officer and First Lieutenant Seiji Tanagawa, who had built one of the most efficient small defensive positions American forces encountered anywhere on Okinawa. 8 light and 2 heavy machine guns sighted at the base of the hill, and mortars on the ridge and the reverse slope, tunnels connecting every position underground, and fields of fire that left almost no dead ground for an attacker to hide in. The first American assault on the morning of April 6th and followed a 10-minute artillery bombardment and got 2 platoons almost to the top before Japanese defenders drove them back with grenades and satchel charges. A second assault an hour later brought tanks, anti-tank guns, and heavy mortars into the attack, and still failed because Tanagawa's men had simply waited out the bombardment inside their caves and come back out to their firing positions the moment it lifted. What broke the position wasn't more firepower. It was Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Mayberry, commanding the battalion, changing the axis of attack, sending one company up the same ridge as before to hold Tanagawa's attention, while a second company worked its way up a separate and partly covered approach on the western flank. Tanagawa, watching the frontal attack from his own observation post, never saw the flanking company coming. It reached the crest without loss. Only 20 of the roughly 110 defenders escaped south, and Lieutenant Tanagawa had held an understrength outpost for 2 days against a division-strength force, repeatedly asked his own superiors for artillery support, and was refused it without explanation for reasons that were never recorded. His stand at the Pinnacle was, by the U.S. Army's own post-war assessment, only the outer edge of what turned out to be one of the most heavily fortified defensive lines Japan built anywhere in the war. And Okinawa was finally secured after nearly 3 months of fighting, and Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, the same officer who had activated the 7th Infantry Division back in 1940, arrived to take command of the 10th Army and found his old division waiting for him, its combat record running unbroken from a fog-covered rock in the Aleutians to the coral ridges of Okinawa. The division that Japanese planners had once dismissed as green, then learned to radio warnings about, then lost pre-war territory to, had fought in more distinct climates and terrain types than almost any other American division of the war, and had done it against defenders who, position after position, chose to hold until there was nothing left to hold with.